Welcome to Product Led Growth Leaders. We have a really cool guest on the show today, Nathan Beckord, an expert on raising capital and startup funding. He is the CEO of Foundersuite. Simultaneously, he is the CEO of Funding Stack. He is the host of the How I Raised It podcast for startup founders who have succeeded in raising capital. And he's been doing that since 2018. And he's got over 275 episodes, also consults through venture archetypes. Nathan, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Likewise. So let's start off. So let's first get down what exactly you do from the VC side of things and what is the nature of your work. Let's start there.
Yeah, my story's pretty straightforward. I've been helping companies raise capital ever since college, which was a long time ago, the 90s. So it's been a long journey of helping companies raise capital. First, it was doing that, working at a couple investment banks, even worked there during the dot-com boom, which was wild and crazy. And then did it a little bit in New York with JP Morgan's private placement group, then came out to Silicon Valley, hung out a shingle, got a couple friends together, and we started helping companies raise capital as consultants for about a decade. And then for the last almost decade, we've been building Foundersuite and more recently Funding Stack as platforms to help companies raise capital. So that's the journey in a nutshell.
Nice. So let's dive into what do VCs look for in startups?
Yeah, a lot of things. A lot of VCs will have a thesis, right? They think they have a thesis around how AI will be adopted in healthcare, right? And they have the thesis around that. They're putting thoughts around that. In many cases, that will be what they put out as their shingle when they go raise money, right? To raise a $50 million venture fund, you've got to go do the same thing startups have to do, go talk to a lot of investors, LPs in that case. And usually you're going out with a thesis. So you've got your thesis, and then you're looking for startups that fit that thesis in most cases. Now, most VCs will also narrow it down a bit more in terms of what stage they focus on. Do they do seed, pre-seed, Series A, Series B, later stage? Some have a geographical focus because they prefer to just invest in startups that are local, or they might have raised money from a regional development entity. So that could be part of their thesis also. They invest in AI healthcare startups in the Pacific Northwest. That could be a thesis. I don't know if that exists or not. And then beyond the check the boxes criteria, a lot of it comes down to gut feel, personality, pattern matching. As the VC does, do I think this startup has what it takes? Do I think this founder has what it takes to build a big business and make me a lot of money, my LPs a lot of money? So I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, so let's dive into that startup thesis or the sort of that thesis that you're talking about. What informs that thesis? Is it like Gartner reports or your own internal analysts saying that this is the best place to put your money? Or is it a philosophy of the firm that we've decided that we're going to support this kind of business?
I think it comes from quite a few different sources. It could be simply the VC's thought that a certain industry is going to be the next big thing, right? Whether it's Web3 or gaming, or there's a lot of stuff going on with AI right now, of course. It could be simply of that. Or in many cases, it's because the VC came from an industry, right? You spent 20 years working at MasterCard, Visa, Chase, Amex, and you have strong opinions on the future of payments. Just as an example, right? You're going to launch a venture fund in the payment space because you know that industry really. You can help make introductions for your portfolio companies to partners, customers, things like that. Like you have a competitive advantage as the investor in that space because you worked in that space. Others, sometimes those theses are not so industry specific. I was at a demo day called Cool Water Capital about a week or so, 2 weeks ago. And it was 28 or so emerging manager venture funds all pitching their theses, basically. And some of them were quite different. Some of them were investing in Midwest startups, flyover state startups. They even call it that. It's not my pejorative. We invested in Midwestern startups that we can then help them get to the coasts, right? That was their thesis, right? They know the Midwest. They've worked in the Midwest, built businesses there. Another was a woman, and I can't remember the name of the fund, but she had spent many years in PR and marketing at a lot of very prominent tech companies. Like she's like a PR and press master. And that was her thesis, is like she's going to help startups that need that PR boost. And that's what will get her good deals. So it comes from a lot of things, a lot of its background, a lot of its vision, where they think a certain industry or market's going to go. Yeah.
So when you're engaging with a startup, what is the best way for them to prove themselves to you? So they come in and making claims and they say, we think we're gonna hockey stick in the next 3 years and we're gonna get all this stuff. And you're gonna have to look for evidence, obviously, because you can't just put capital behind something that doesn't meet its goals. So what do you look for and how do they prove themselves and demonstrate their worth?
It's as all my answers, it's a lot of things, right? It really can depend a lot. But let's, to answer that, let's put yourselves in the shoes of an investor. I mean, you've got a $50 million fund. You have a lot of startups coming at you all day long from the moment you get up until the moment you go to sleep, and even in between those time periods, coming at you seeking that money, seeking that capital. So how do you filter through all that noise as an investor? Obviously, any of them that have traction, right? Customers, revenue, growth metrics, unit economics that are sexy and exciting. That's a great way to differentiate. That's a great way to both pick a startup. And if you're the startup, that's a great way to differentiate, right? You've been able to get this off the ground by bootstrapping through your own hustle, whatever it is. And you've got some pretty exciting metrics around this. To summarize that, I'd say it's, what does your growth look like? What does your customers look like? What are your unit economics to acquire those customers? Things like churn, prove that you can keep customers on, they're paying you. That's all very exciting. Now, if you don't have that, a lot of early stage startups don't have that. What is your background and track record as a person, as a human? I'll give you an example. We just released, not to plug our own podcast, but we just released a podcast a couple of days ago featuring a guy named Brad Porter of Collaborative Robotics. So this is Brad's first startup, but Brad has a crazy good track record at tech companies in Silicon Valley. He worked at Netscape, one of the first browsers, as an early engineer there. Went on to Tellme, went to Scale AI. He worked at Amazon and built their robotics program from 50,000 robots to 500,000 robots. And now he's starting his own thing. He raised a couple rounds basically based on his track record. He didn't have revenue, didn't really have customers for the first couple funding rounds, but people say, look at this trajectory of this guy's career. I want to jump on what's next, right? So that's, I'd say those are the two. Those are the two biggies.
Right.
Show me traction or show me an amazing track record of other things you've done. And then, of course, there's a bunch of others. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 we could go into if you want, but those are the two best ones. Yeah.
I've heard that people invest in teams, not ideas, or that it's better to, how true is that? Is that because it seems to be the case based upon what you're saying that the people involved ends up being largely important compared to the idea?
Yeah, definitely. And you can go, and one of the adages I think you'll hear VCs say sometimes is that the idea will change over time, but it's really the jockey we want to bet on, not the horse, because the horse might change and probably will change. And you can point to a lot of very successful startups. As a couple examples, Twitter was a podcasting app, if I'm getting this right, called Odeo originally, and they pivoted a few times to end up to be Twitter. PayPal had a few different iterations. They were like something for Palm Pilots. I mean, going way back here, but right, they were like software for or security or crypto for Palm Pilots. I'm probably getting this wrong. They were also doing a few other things until he ended up with PayPal. So I think there's the argument for betting on the team, not the idea. And any idea, once it hits the market, it's like that quote. I'm probably butchering all these quotes, but it's that Mike Tyson quote. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the nose, right? Same thing with startups. You've got a great idea, but once you get into the market and get real customers and there's competition, things like that, you're getting punched in the nose. So you want to be backing the right boxers. I'm mixing up a lot of metaphors. I hope this
it's good.
Kind of makes sense. Yeah.
So one of the things that I've heard working with a lot of startups, consulting from the UX side, and then hearing what the VCs are asking for, one of the things that I've come across is people are using a tool, but sometimes they want to talk to the people using the tool and they say, okay, this is, say, a tool for engineers. And
Yeah.
they want to talk to the engineers. Are you going to use this tool? Is your organization going to use it? Is this going to be really helpful? Is this going to help? Is this going to be a game changer? Is it going to be a sticky software? And a lot of that kind of goes to these tools need to work well with the users. And in your work and your team's work, how important is UX, usability, the seeing how much the tool resonates with the actual users? Does that play a large role in your calculus?
In terms of being fundable,
Yeah, in terms of being fundable, yes.
yeah, it certainly does, right? But when you're an early stage startup, your UX is not going to be polished. It's not going to have all the features you ultimately want it to have. It's not going to have all the features and functionality that customers want and that it eventually might get to. And so one of the good signs is like, hey, this product is pretty janky. It's hard to use, but people are still like on a wait, like getting on a wait list to sign up to use it. It's the kludgy experience, but it must have so much value there. There's some kernel that people are willing to overlook those problems and still sign up, pay for it, whatever. That's a really huge sign. That's a good sign that you've identified a little rich vein of customer need. I will use even our product, Foundersuite. Man, I look at the first iterations, our MVP of this, and it's just I want to bury it. It's so embarrassing. It's so cartoonish and didn't do much and was just laughably simplistic and comical. But hey, it was enough to get us to the next point, and it just gets better and better over time. That's one of the beauty things, especially about software, is you're building code, you're releasing new code releases every couple of weeks. Like the product is getting better every two to 3 weeks. It gets incrementally better, and if you're able to stay alive long enough, it can get pretty good. I feel like we've achieved that with our product, coming from very humble beginnings. And there's a lot of difficult periods in between where people are like, I'm canceling, this doesn't do what I want it to do. I want it to do XYZ in addition to ABC. We just haven't built that yet. You've got to overcome a lot of that. But eventually you starts to get good. And then it's, hey, this is actually really good. And I think that's when it really gets exciting to both, customers and investors, frankly, too.
So then it does sound like it's part of the growth, the plan for growth then, because like you point out, that if you are able to get people excited about something that looks duct taped together, and
Yeah.
people are excited about, that's a promising sign that you're fulfilling an actual need. But then you are mentioning that it does get better over the following years. So is the usability part of the plan for growth and that, or do you just let it come together and you just trust the team to fill the gaps?
It's a good question. I think you let it come together. Sure, you're always striving for that. And you should be, of course, and people are. But you just can't, you're not going to get it right out of the box, especially if you've been building before launch. We could have a long conversation about building in public and getting feedback on ideas even before you write your first line of code, for example. That's a whole topic of its own. But I think it comes together, right? You get people, it's almost in that transitional year. You got the hype of the early days where you're like, hey, I've got this new idea for a new category. No one's really done this before. I remember that with our early days with Foundersuite, like no one had really built a platform for startups raising capital. And so there's a lot of excitement just around this concept. And then those middle days, you're like, you're getting people using it, but some people are canceling. I love this concept. I love the vision, but it's not really there for me yet. Okay, if you can survive that kind of valley of death and keep building, keep getting better, you get on the other side of that valley, you're like, hey, this actually is working now. It's like it's functioning and providing value. And of course, there's always more to add. In some cases, we're still a small startup and we're competing like on our CRM against a HubSpot. HubSpot's a $34 billion company. We're a much smaller company. So we're not going to be the same as that. As long as it's getting better and doing the core things, I think that's a beautiful thing.
So we all know that startups follow the latest buzz terms. Right now, it's been AI for the past year and a half or so. and NFTs were huge a couple of years ago and things like that. Do Can you tell me a little bit about that landscape? Because I imagine that a lot of startups just start adding those buzzwords to whatever they're doing. Now you've got to sift through and see who's really doing what. And so is it something that you say, okay, I'm excited about, but that I'm going to have to put on some sharper goggles to really see who's doing it? Like, how does the buzz term flurry affect your work or affect the way you view things?
Yeah, you would not believe how many startups have suddenly added .ai to their domain or their name, right? Even some kind of more established startups are starting to do that. And it's always a fine line between, hey, are they just adding that buzzy and maybe get investors? All these investors want to see AI startups right now, but a lot of startups that are coming to them have rebranded as an AI startup, but they're not really an AI startup. So there's a fine line between, hey, these guys are just window dressing, packaging, or hey, this is actually a true AI focused startup, right? And of course, those trends come and go pretty quickly, right? And you saw the Web3 stuff or even the metaverse stuff, like it was hot for a period of time, super hot, and then it just fizzles. And there's always that deciding, is this the hot song of the moment, or is this one that's really going to persist and be a decades long change? Hard to predict. We have not, to be full credit, we have not put in Foundersuite.ai or anything like that, but we are starting to work some AI into our product because I think it's a longer term trend. So I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. It does. So let's go to what's going on right now in the funding space. So a lot of people are seeing the past couple of years have been really difficult in terms of funding. There's been lots of layoffs of lots of
Yeah.
jobs. This attitude of it's a time period where you have to be really careful. If you're selling, you've got to be really aggressive. From your perspective, what kind of time period or season do we seem to be in right now, and how should we look at that?
Yeah, I feel like we're at a turning point, right? I'm a sailor and I'm in San Francisco Bay and I'm always watching. If I'm going to go out sailing, I'm watching the tides very closely, right? You have a flood tide, meaning all the water's rushing into the bay. You have an ebb tide, meaning water's rushing out of the bay, and you have slack. Slack is that intermediate time between when the tides are changing directions. I feel like we're a bit at a slack tide right now in terms of the funding market. We had a really hot, call it 21, 22, which was boom time for fundraising and raising capital, both on the startup side and the venture fund side. A lot of venture funds raised a lot of money for their funds, 21, 22. 23, pretty rough. Very rough. In fact, we see a lot of deal like charts that show deal volume like cut in half, right? That's a huge drop. And now here we are, Q2 of 2024. I actually feel like it's starting to, after a pretty strong ebb tide for most of 23, I feel like we're at the start of a new flood tide. I'm hoping I'm right. Sometimes these things can reverse course, but we're seeing a little data. We're seeing more activity on our platforms, on Foundersuite in terms of startups getting funded. Also, I've seen some data published by Carta, which is a cap table company, showing that VCs are calling down their capital, which means they're gearing up to invest more. And a few other just data points that are signaling maybe the beginning of an uptick. So to answer your question, I think I'm hopeful and feel that we might be after a rough year and a half, 18 months or so, we might be at the start of a new kind of boom time, or at least a more buoyant market, I think.
I hope you're right. That sounds like potentially good news, but knock on wood. What does FounderSuite.ai do?
Our AI piece, we're not rebranding the company to FounderSuite.ai, but our AI piece that
Gotcha.
we're integrating is ChatGPT, right? We're taking low-hanging fruit, starting with that. Let's get this in there, see if people like it, if it's useful, and then maybe expand on that. I have some future ideas of where we can go with AI, but our starting point is pretty simple. We have an email tool. The typical process is startups come in, identify a list of investors that invest in healthcare AI in the Pacific Northwest region, right? Whatever it may be. They build a list of investors in that. And then next step is getting in touch with those investors. And that can be through warm intros, connections, or there is some cold outreach that founders often do. If you're going to do in cold outreach, your emails to those investors should be really precise and specific. So we're integrating ChatGPT to help founders writing those emails. It's always nice. Investors can tell, I think they can tell if something's AI written, but they can definitely tell if a founder has just sent out a mass blast email, which is a super bad thing to do. So we're trying to help personalize that outreach a bit more with AI.
Awesome. Okay, great. Everyone check out Foundersuite and also the podcast, How I Raised It. Nathan Beckord, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. It was fun.